You get to be high on these ridge lines looking down at these massive valleys and feel like you're on top of the world. And then you get to look up and realize that in fact you are infinitesimally small. You're surrounded by this incredible massive landscape, and yet you get to exist in terrain that feels relatively simple by comparison. Welcome everyone. So my name is Jack. I'll be sharing stories and insights about traveling through Alaska, and then also giving a rundown on one of my favorite trips in the state. I love this trip so much. I'm the owner of a small, tight-knit guiding company based out of Seattle, but we run trips and custom expeditions in the States and all over the world. I've been exploring the mountains my whole life, and they've been a sanctuary and an escape and a place to connect with others. And when I was really young, I just had this natural gravitational pull towards the far north and towards Alaska. There was just something about it that captured my heart and captured my soul and captured my imagination. And for a long while, all the books that I wanted to read were books by Farley Mowat or about Christopher McCandless adventuring up there. It just had my heart, my soul. And so right out of high school, my first job, I moved up to Alaska and started guiding up there. And one of the first trips that I did was in the Ruth Gorge, which is a place that we'll go to, or rather fly through on this trip. And I really had no idea what we were doing, but we flew out to the Ruth Gorge and spent 10 days basically just stuck in a tent drinking whiskey and listening to podcasts. And that was about it, as 10 to 15 feet of snow just dumped on our tents, and we were basically just shoveling ourselves out of a tomb the whole time. So it was quite the adventure. But then on the last day, we had this wild little saving grace. The storm cleared out and the sun came out, and then all that 15 feet of snow that had been landed on the mountains around us came tumbling down in the grandest avalanches I've ever seen in my life. And we were in a totally safe spot, but it was a miraculous and pretty awe-inspiring event to watch avalanches rip off 6,000-foot peaks. The Ruth Gorge is a pretty spectacular place that way. On my 21st birthday, I went back yet again to continue my summer migration and spent my birthday looking at the summit of Alaska, looking at Denali, and making my prayers for the year to come. When I was 22, I went back and spent 35 days traversing the Wrangell St. Elias Range. If you look at this photo really closely, you can see some people down towards the bottom of the screen to get a sense for the scale of the place. I think one thing that's taken me a long time to learn is how scale in Alaska just doesn't really work the way that it's used to being worked in the lower 48. Still really have no sense for scale and no capacity to understand just how grand things are. It's pretty incredible. Today, we're going to be talking about Denali as an overview, and then specifically backpacking Denali's Whale's Tail, which is a really cool trip that we're running this summer, some gear and logistics for the trip, and then 2022 trips overview. So Denali is right in the center of the state, and it's just one of a lot of national parks that we run trips in. Denali is right there, kind of in the center. And then we also run trips in Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, the Wrangell St. Elias Range, Gates of the Arctic National Park, and then a little place that's not actually a national park, but is equally as beautiful as the rest, called Prince William Sound, where we run some sea kayaking expeditions. It's the land of 5 different indigenous groups, so the Atna, the Dena'ina, the Koyukon, the Upper Kuskokwim, and the Tanana peoples. Each have their own language and different traditions, but they're all part of a group called the Athabaskan or Dene folks. 1/6 of the national park is covered by glacier, so there's just a whole mass of snow and ice there. And the national park is traditionally accessed just by one big road that goes all the way into the park or a long ways into the park. And that's kind of your only option if you're going to access the park, not by plane. The mountain was first climbed in 1913, and these days a lot of folks will climb it by the West Buttress route, which is a fairly non-technical route, but still has some pretty big crevasse danger. And they'll fly in to base camp at 7,200 feet and then work their way over 2 to 3 weeks to the summit at 20,302 feet, or 20,320 feet. Here's a handstand on the summit from a while ago. When people think about Denali, they usually think about bears, 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 and there's something really cool that happens in this valley. It's this giant funnel, and so you get tons of wildlife that gets funneled through the valley of Denali, and so you see tons of bears and tons of moose and tons of wolves sometimes, or coyotes. It depends on what's there at the time. But one of the coolest things that I think is in Denali is this super strange creature. This is a frog, and it Actually survives the super cold winters by freezing all the way through. So it freezes all the way through, its heart stops beating, its blood stops moving, but it has cryogenic chemicals in its system that allows it to survive when spring comes back around. Everything warms up again and it goes back to living its life. I always find this photo to just be pretty remarkable as like one of the little aliens that exists among us on Earth. There's a lot of ways to go on a backpacking trip to Denali. You can drive up to the park and then take a bus down that road, get a permit the same day from the National Park Service, and then kind of like pick your adventure. There's no trails in the park though. And so backpacking Denali, you have to be really comfortable off-trail navigation and making your own routes. The landscape is just massive and the weather's pretty fickle, so you really want to know what you're doing. But the National Park Service is there. You can get permits for free, usually, to go camping anywhere in the park pretty much. The downside though, and I've learned this the hard way, is that a lot of the backpacking in Denali is in something close to bog. So every step you take, you sink down 1.5 feet and your Achilles tendons start to hurt pretty brutally. And then you also have the classic famous Alaskan alder. So the alder will grow super thick. And then you find yourself doing the Alaska schwack, is what we call it. So just crawling on hands and knees, like pushing the brush out of your way, tumbling through the alder, trying to like get where you're going. And usually, and I've done this before, those days are about, you cover half a mile for a full day of travel, or maybe a mile if you're lucky. So not all backpacking Denali is like that, but a lot of it is. And so you're like, well, why are we doing this webinar right now about backpacking Denali if that's the case? It's because we go to a really cool piece of land in Denali called the Whale's Tail. It's a pretty magical spot. And it's exactly as it sounds. So it looks exactly like a whale's tail. This is one of my favorite campsites in the world with these mega views. So here's the whale's tail. If you look right in the center of the screen, that biggest glacier that comes down towards the bottom of the screen is the Ruth Glacier. And then on the other side of that little strip of land is the Tokasitna Glacier. And right in between those two glaciers is what we call the whale's tail. It kind of looks like it from this perspective, but we'll get a better perspective soon. In this photo, it looks pretty small, but in reality, that's a massive piece of landscape right there that you could spend a lot of time covering. So the Ruth Gorge is off to your right, and those cliffs that you can see above the Ruth Gorge, those are all 6,000 feet tall, to give you a sense of perspective. And then that mountain in the distance, of course, is Denali. So the whale's tail gives you this really cool way to get really close to Denali, to backpack high alpine meadow and high alpine tundra without all of the ruggedness of some of the lower lands in Denali, and feel almost like you're mountaineering or almost like you're an alpine climber, but without all the snow and cold and frigidness and mountaineering boots and all of that craziness. This is a rough idea of our route. And so in Alaska, routes are kind of like, you know, we make plans and then we're like, okay, plan A, that's out the window. Plan B, that's out the window. Let's go to plan F or D. So we make lots of different plans and then we see what the weather gives us. It's a really grand landscape and it doesn't really care too much for what you have in mind. That being said, at the top of the screen, you can see a little blue arrow pointing to a lake. And that lake is called Backside Lake. It's in the retreating path of Backside Glacier. And a float plane can land right there. And so that will be our access to the whale's tail. Right to the north of that, kind of cool if you're a climber maybe, or if you're excited by climbing, is Mount Church, Grosvenor, and Johnson. And those three peaks, to give you a sense of scale, have some of the longest ice climbs in the world. Really like mega test pieces of ice climbing and alpinism. Our route will go counterclockwise and we'll piece together a route covering as much of the whale's tail as we can. On day one, we'll meet in Anchorage. Anchorage is kind of like a rough and tumble city, but it's actually one of my favorite places on earth. If I didn't care about having a little bit more sunlight in my life, I would live there full time, but that's why I live in Seattle and not there. But in the summer, it's magic to me. The sun never sets, which for some people is a challenge. But for me, it's perfect because if you like sunrises and sunsets, it's just persistent magic. You have the full day, and from about 9 p.m. to 6 in the morning is just persistent sunset. So everything is bathed in just this beautiful alpenglow light. We'll stay in a beautiful lakeside hotel in Anchorage, and that's where we'll gather and get to know each other, meet, go over gear, go over our route, look at maps together, do a whole risk management talk and talk about safety and that sort of thing, and get excited for our trip. We'll be leaving first thing in the morning the next day. So it's the time to really like feel confident about what we're about to take off and do. And we'll do all of that over a beautiful dinner and drinks and some laughs as well. If you find yourself showing up in Anchorage beforehand, say you show up that morning or you show up maybe the day before even, some of my favorite things in the Anchorage area are Turnagain Arm, which is what we're looking at right now. So like, I love watching sunset at Turnagain Arm. It just fills my heart with so much joy to be there. And sometimes if you're lucky, you can even see some humpback whales coming up Turnagain Arm. So that's like, ooh, that's peak magicness right there. If you can get to Turnagain Arm, watch the sunset, see the whales coming past Beluga Point, perfect. Or, and this is kind of cool because it actually lines up perfectly with the start of our trip, you can watch people surfing the board tide. And so Alaska always has these really big tides, but sometimes they're even grander than normal. And so you get these tides, like when we're there, the tide will be a 25-foot difference. And so all that water pushing its way up Turnagain Arm yields this wave that you can surf for up to a mile long if you're good enough to try. But I just go out and watch people when they line up. So if you wanted to show up that morning, you go out and see the people trying to surf the board tide. And then if you show up a full day beforehand, it's really cool to pop over to Prince William Sound. It's just an hour away to Whittier. And Prince William Sound is also one of my favorite places on the planet. I used to sea kayak guide there a lot, and I still do some sea kayaking expeditions there in the summers. And you can take a boat and see 26 glaciers all in one 6-hour tour. So 26 tidewater glaciers all calving into the ocean, all putting massive icebergs into the water. It's a pretty magical spot. In the morning, we'll have a big breakfast. So we're day 2 now. We'll have a big breakfast at the hotel. And then right after breakfast, we'll grab all of our things and we'll head right to Lake Hood Seaplane Base, which is the busiest seaplane base on the planet. Down in the States, like if you were to take a Greyhound bus or a taxi, up in Alaska, you're much more likely to take a plane somewhere, like a little plane. And this, I think, is maybe my favorite part of the state. Bush plane flights in Alaska are like almost always my highlight of any trip. There's just something spectacular about getting in this tiny little plane and flying through massive mountains. And also, Alaska bush plane pilots are definitely some characters. We'll just say they're pretty gritty and they've got some good stories. So that's always my other highlight, is getting to talk to Alaska bush plane pilots. There's a saying up there, walk a month or fly an hour. And that is so true. It's also good marketing for the plane companies, but it's incredibly true. If we were trying to walk to Backside Glacier Lake, where we'll start our trip from Anchorage, it would take us probably 2.5 to 3 months. So a plane makes life a lot easier. The views are spectacular. We'll be flying through these massive glacially carved valleys, looking at beautiful braided rivers from above, spotting moose, spotting grizzly bears, spotting Dall sheep. And all around us will be these massive granite walls that extend from valley floor all the way up 6,000 feet with a mile-wide glacier in the middle. If you've ever been to Yosemite, you can think about this like Yosemite, except 2.5 times bigger with a big glacier in the middle. And we'll be right in the middle flying through it. In July and August, the snow melts off the glaciers down low, and you can see these miraculous textures all around the ice. And from above, everything starts to resemble a set of lungs. So you have these braided glaciers coming down the mountains that all look like lungs, that feature into rivers that are all braided and look like lungs or veins. And everything seems like one massive organism growing. The plane will put us down on a little lake, on Backside Lake. And that's a pretty miraculous moment at that point, because we unload all of our gear, we pull up onto the beach, we look around and take in our surroundings, and then eventually the pilot says, okay, adios, and takes off on the lake and pulls up into the sky and pulls around the bend. And the echoes of the motor are trailing down the glacial valley. And as the last echoes and last buzz of the engine fade away, all of a sudden, it's just miraculous silence. It's like, it reminds me of being in the kitchen of my house and turning on the air vent for cooking. And I put it on high, and then I just forget that it's on. And I exist for hours that way, thinking, why is life so loud? And then all of a sudden I remember and I turn it off, and then the silence is deafening. It's similar to that, except much more profound. And it's usually a pretty intense moment for folks to let the remoteness and the solitude settle in and to absorb the landscape and to start to slow down. I think that's what these trips are really about for me, is an opportunity to slow down, to exist at a different pace, to communicate with the world in a different way, to communicate with each other in a different way. And that's why for all these years I've kept doing these trips, because it's an opportunity to connect deeply with the things that I care about in the world and to feel a sense of awe. From that lake, we'll camp there that first night, and then we'll set off. We'll spend the next 4 days exploring the Whale's Tail. We'll have a rough itinerary, but it's hard saying exactly how things will shake out. But we'll plan on covering around 5 to 8 miles a day, which if you're used to hiking on trail might seem like a very small amount. But again, there's no trails out here. So all of our navigation is from maps and maybe a GPS and our own experience and our own intuition. And all of our hiking is based off of where we feel like we can travel safely. The views from the Whale's Tail it's not really worth talking about them. You should just go experience them. But you're surrounded by this incredible, massive landscape, and yet you get to exist in terrain that feels relatively simple by comparison. This is one of my favorite campsites in the world. Just get like incredible views all around. And that's what's so wild in this landscape, is to feel not necessarily small and not necessarily large, but both simultaneously. You get to be high on these ridge lines looking down at these massive valleys and feel like you're on top of the world. And then you get to look up and realize that in fact you are infinitesimally small. We'll sleep in really nice tents that'll keep us warm and dry, but also hopefully light enough to not break our backs. And we'll store all of our food in bear canisters, not just our food, but also all of our sunscreen, all of our lip chap, all of our toothpaste, everything that could possibly have a scent will go in bear canisters. And this helps us keep a really safe camp. There are bears out there, but we'll talk a little bit more about bear safety soon. In the evenings, you can expect that we'll make dinner. And some days maybe we'll be so tired, it'll just be time to pass out and go to bed. And some evenings we'll spend time around camp laughing and sharing stories and playing cards, or my personal favorite, having dance parties if people are down for that. And the evenings can also be time to be alone, to journal, to spend time reflecting on what you want for the coming year. It's time to make how you please. On day, say 4, I think time really starts to take on a different rhythm. There's something about disconnecting from this outside world that just takes time. And by day 4, everyone started to slow down a little bit. Everyone started to tune into a different pattern. And then the days really just become about the rhythm of walking. Our route will take us into increasingly alpine landscapes. So we'll start a little bit lower and spend the first few days climbing into increasingly more alpine landscape and getting closer and closer to the glaciers that we've been looking at. Sometimes the weather can be a little burly in Denali. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But even on trips where it's rained every single day, which isn't often, but even on those trips, people still reach out to me these days and tell me that it was the best thing they've ever done in their entire lives. Beautiful days by the glacier in the sun. Sometimes on a lot of our routes, we'll get a chance to get onto the glacier and actually traverse the glacier a little ways. And this is really cool because seeing into glacial ice that's millions of years old is a pretty magical experience. The cracks, you can look into them and see this beautiful, beautiful deep blue that goes down 70 feet to 100 feet. And then there's these places called moulins where a little rock, moulin is the French word for drill, and a little rock has drilled itself into the ice just from meltwater, slowly, slowly, slowly. And eventually, sometimes these holes become huge, huge. We call them toilet bowls, and go down hundreds of feet. And so we'll get some chance to explore the moulins and the cracks and drink glacier water that's thousands of years old. And it's the best water I've ever drank in my life. Eventually, we'll reach kind of the top of our route, per se, and start the mosey down. We'll leave that rugged alpine environment and start heading towards terrain that's a little bit lower, a little bit greener, and work our way back towards Backside Lake. I find that there's something funny about wilderness trips out here, in that I spent a lifetime going out to wild, remote places, oftentimes to get away from it all. And yet, on every single trip, the thing that has stuck out to me most is the people. Deep, deep connections. And when I ask myself, okay, like, is my job meaningful? Is the work that I do meaningful? I sometimes grapple with that. And I think These days, the answer feels very much yes. I think a lot of us are grappling for connection and grappling for meaning. And I always leave these trips with connections that I hold on to and I cherish for a long time afterwards. People always want to know about the wildlife. So we'll probably see some fierce little pikas and some sheep potentially. And of course, these folks, that paw is probably about the size of my hand right there. I've seen a bunch of grizzly bears in Alaska. We'll talk about bear safety towards the end of this presentation, but I've never had a bad encounter with a bear in Alaska. And I think part of that, the bears up there have seen so few people. On the whale's tail, we will probably see 0 other humans the entire trip. There's just so few people that go out there that when bears see a human, we're still somewhat alien to them. We're still a foreign creature that they're unsure about. I had this one moment up in Alaska with bears that was just like a wild Kodak moment out of a movie. I was in this massive glacial valley, and on the bottom of the glacial valley is 3,000 feet of the Scottish Highlands. The middle 10,000 feet is the Grand Canyon, and the upper 4,000 feet is covered in glaciers dripping over the Grand Canyon. And there was this mama grizzly bear and her 2 cubs running directly at us, and above them, scrambling up the cliffs, tossing these big boulders down, was a whole pack of sheep scrambling up the cliff to get away from the bears, and above them was 2 eagles flying in circle. And my heart was thumping out of my chest as this mama bear was running right towards us. And then right before the raging river, she turned off course and headed a different way. And the whole time I realized, oh, she really doesn't even care about us. She's just doing her thing. Another time in Alaska, I was doing the Alaska schwack that I referred to at the beginning of this presentation. And it's so thick that you can't see anything at all, really. And I came into a clearing, pulled the branches apart, and there was a grizzly bear right here looking directly in my face, close enough to lick me on the nose. And we made direct eye contact for approximately 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. And then the grizzly bear just turned, showed me its butt, and just whoop, ran away. So we'll see grizzly bears, hopefully, and we'll see them from a safe distance. The views out there are endlessly astounding, and the evenings, hopefully we'll get some really good views of Denali off in the distance. If you remember that initial photo, Denali is just right at the top of the whale's tail, right above us. The terrain can be sort of rugged. So if you've never backpacked before, this might be a hard first trip, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But if you have a little bit of backpacking experience, you should have no problem backpacking this kind of terrain off trail, as long as you have some high boots that cover your ankles real well. Eventually, in this kind of bittersweet moment, we find ourselves meandering back towards Backside Lake down these big ridge lines and find ourselves back at the lake. We can have one final night there, and that final night is like a pretty important moment to start to reflect and think, okay, like what did I take from this experience? What came out of this existence out here? And spend some time journaling usually. Usually we'll take some alone time, have approximately 2 hours of just personal quiet time to sit in the space and be with yourself. In the morning, we'll continue that theme and we'll do some sharing, share with each other, what is it like to be out here? What did you learn that you want to bring back into that busier world? What do you want to leave behind out here? I am still learning things and taking away things that I've done from trips from a decade ago and from 7 years ago and 5 years ago. And I really believe that these landscapes have shaped me and changed me in pretty significant ways. And more importantly, like the groups that I've been with have shaped me and changed me in pretty incredible ways. I am really excited to share that with you. The plane will come in the morning, and that will probably be the first real noise that we've heard in a long time. And the plane will land on Backside Lake, right where it dropped us off 6 days ago. If the weather's good, we'll have the chance to do a whole flight tour around Denali. So from our spot on Backside Lake, we'll head up the Great Gorge. I'm looking at the right side of the screen here. Up the Great Gorge, past Don Sheldon Amphitheater, past the North Fork Glacier, past Mount Silverthorn, around the backside of Denali, which is listed as Mount McKinley here, past Mount Hunter, which is also known as Buguya, past Mount Foraker, also known as Sultana, and we will probably be able to spot some climbers on the mountain, and certainly down at Kahiltna Base Camp, and then back down the Tokasitna Glacier. And from the Tokasitna Glacier and from the Ruth Glacier, we'll be able to look back at all the landscape that we traversed And hopefully we'll even be able to point out little spots like, oh, that's where we camped on day 3. And that's where we had that little bushwhack section on day 4. And that's where you said that really funny joke on day 5. And hopefully we'll be able to retrace our steps from the sky and etch it into memory that way. Hopefully we'll also get a really beautiful view of Denali from the sky, from eye level. These trips are really special to me, and they also require a lot of logistics. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time just talking about the logistics for this kind of adventure. I'll just finish off by saying, before I move to logistics, that plane will land us back in Anchorage. And from there, we'll probably hug each other and say goodbye and part ways and share contact information and share photos. And if people are game for it, we'll share a final dinner all together for parting ways. So logistics for an adventure like this. First thing, who's this trip for? This is a photo of a moose in a kiddie pool, as is apparent. A pretty common sighting in Alaska in the summertime. The moose get hot, the kiddie pools are out, and they take them for their own. So who's this trip for? If you have never backpacked before, maybe not the best introduction to backpacking, but if you've done a little bit of camping and some backpacking on trail, and you're down trained to get in really good shape for this trip's totally open for you. You don't need to be an ultra marathon runner or like even a regular marathon runner, but you should be comfortable hiking maybe 10 miles on trail per day to make this trip fun and not a struggle for you. Our packs will be around hopefully no more than 35 pounds, 40 pounds. And so if you're comfortable hiking 10 miles on trail, carrying a pack that's 35 or 40 pounds for 6 days, then this is right up your alley. Especially if you would like to learn a lot about off-trail travel. If you're someone who's like really excited to start doing your own trips off-trail in Alaska and Denali or any of those other national parks, and you want a lot of mentorship of like, okay, here's how to make this trip happen, or here's how these logistics work, or here's how to read a map. I love teaching folks. I love sharing knowledge and passing on knowledge and sharing tips and tricks and ideas for future expeditions. So if you are newer to backpacking, but excited to learn, this would be an awesome time for you. And also if you've backpacked a ton in your life, but you're just like, you know what, I want someone to take care of logistics. I want someone to make this a really smooth experience and someone who has a depth of knowledge about the area to share this with me, then this is also for you. Some things that you'll need for the trip. Gear out here is super key and important. So rain jacket and pants is like number one. If I could only bring one thing, that might be it. A backpack, a sleeping bag, some really good hiking shoes or boots. Most people prefer boots to have something to cover up their ankles because the terrain is so rugged, but I sometimes wear hiking shoes as well just to go a little bit lighter. Some wool socks, and then lots of warm synthetic layers. Out there, cotton really just doesn't do it for you because when it's wet, it just doesn't keep you warm. So some synthetic layers. And I'm a really big advocate that like, you don't need to go to REI and drop thousands of dollars on gear. You can go to your thrift store or work with your friends to come up with all the gear that you need for the trip. We'll send you a whole gear list for everything you need. So you can always reach out with questions and that sort of thing if you're curious. And then all the miscellaneous. We will cover all of the group gear. So all of the tents, all the kitchen tents, all the cooking supplies, all the fuel, and then also all dinner and breakfast will be covered for the trip. Lunch, we ask people to bring their own personal snacks. And the reason for that is like, we want you to be fueled by the things that you know work for you. And lunch basically starts when breakfast is over and until dinner begins. So it's kind of like moving lunch, snacking all day, and we ask you to pack those for yourself, but we'll throw in a bunch of dessert treats and things like that as well. I'd like to take a minute to talk through risk management. Alaska is a really big place and it can feel really intimidating. And some people can be like, whoa, a fly-in trip into Denali? I'm like back in this remote place. And that can make people feel a little uncomfortable. So let's just talk through some risk management things and some risk management concerns, either for a personal trip that you choose to do there or for a trip with Indigo Alpine Guides. We talked about bears a little bit. They are definitely more afraid of us than we are of them, regardless of how afraid you are. They're definitely curious, but generally not a threat in areas like this. When you hear about bears as threats, it's usually in places that have a lot more human contact, like Yosemite or Glacier National Park, where bears are becoming accustomed to humans. But in Alaska, kind of contrary to public opinion, actually bears are generally much less of a problem because they have so little contact with humans, especially in this part of Denali. That being said, we'll take the utmost precaution with bears. And so some things that we can do to manage that risk are having a larger group size, So we're not spending a lot of time by ourselves traveling the country. We'll always be together, keeping everything that has a smell in bear canisters. And then we also will carry bear spray, which is just like a high density cayenne pepper spray. In the worst case scenario, we need to convince a bear to get out of our hair. Weather, we'll have backup itineraries. Generally, we can fly into Backside Lake, no problem. And sometimes the weather does what it wants to do. And so within this itinerary, we have built in the possibility to maybe not fly out in the morning, but maybe fly out in the evening instead. Or if the weather's really, really rugged, we might reroute entirely to, say, Lake Clark National Park or Wrangell St. Elias or one of our other places in the state. It is really, really remote. If you've never backpacked in Alaska before, this will probably be the most remote backpacking trip you've ever gone on in your life. But at the same time, we'll make really conservative decisions, and we have emergency communication devices and a whole risk management network that can help us in case something goes wrong. So we'll carry satellite messengers for emergency communication. All of our guides are trained in wilderness first aid, and some of them are EMTs, and we've all spent over a decade and a half learning the ways of the outdoors or guiding professionally for over a decade and a half as well. COVID-19, that's a question that some folks have as well. All of the participants on our trips these days are going to be vaccinated. And then we'll also ask everyone to have a PCR or antigen test within the first 24 hours of trip start. So hopefully by then getting over-the-counter tests will be really easy, and that shouldn't be a problem. Over a decade of working professionally in outdoors, I've never personally had any big incidents, and neither has my guiding company. So some overall logistics, 7 days, it'll be 6 days and 5 nights of backpacking. The group size will be max 8. So we could have, say, 2 guides and up to 8 guests, or 1 guide and up to 6 guests. That cost covers all of your flights. So flights on any Alaska trip are just a giant portion of the cost, but they also make the trip possible. And then it covers all the guiding, the accommodations on the first night of anchorage, all the food except for lunches, and then all the group supplies. So first aid kits, emergency communication devices, tents, and Denali National Park entrance fees. And I'll just note here that actually we have a trip going to Lake Clark National Park July 2nd through 8th. So you could consider being super duper epic and going to Lake Clark July 2nd through 8th, having a 2-day break, and then going also with me to Denali July 10th through 16th. And if that's something you'd be excited about, feel free to reach out and talk through that, because that'd be super cool. These trips are, to use a phrase that gets thrown around really loosely a lot, like very much trips of a lifetime. And it feels like a massive privilege to be able to share those with people and experience them with people. And I think one of my favorite parts is seeing a group dynamic at the beginning and then seeing a group dynamic at the end. It's a really cool chance to come together with people that maybe you've never met before. People show up single all the time or show up by themselves all the time to our trips, and meet all these amazing people who have shared loves for the outdoors from all around the country and all around the world. I have gone back to Alaska every summer for a decade for a reason. I think I'll keep going back every summer for the rest of my life because it means the world to me. It's where I've made a lot of big life changes. It's where I've connected deeply to who I am and to the things I care about. And I would really, really love to share that space and that experience with some of you this summer or in the years to come. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing the space.